I actually came to reading maybe a little later than a lot of people who become writers. It wasn't until really the very end of high school that I started reading with any kind of seriousness at all. And it wasn't backwards or forwards. I would pull, my father is a really voracious reader and has an amazing library, and I would just pull books off the shelf, not really knowing very much
What
about
did you
them.
read before high school? Did you didn't read?
I just didn't read very much.
Whatever they assigned you.
I didn't even read that. I watched TV and I rode bikes and whatever kids do.
Yes.
But then, for whatever reason, at a certain moment, books started to really speak to me, and I was pulling them off as much for their covers, really, as anything else. I was just experimenting, and so I got a really wide sampling very quickly.
What was the first big reading experience where you pulled something from the shelf which had a nice cover, nice color, something slightly pornographic or something like that?
I was going to say it was The Joy of Sex, actually. But in terms of a real book, it was Our Bodies, Ourselves. No, I'm just kidding. In terms of a real book, it was Invisible Cities, Calvino. I really remember reading that.
Your dad had that?
Oh yeah, my dad had great books, really great books.
Nice.
Why did you grow up backwards, literally?
Well, just because I became interested in literature when my teachers were assigning James Joyce. And so I began with Joyce, and then got to college, and we all had to find, we had to get a very difficult book to read, or at least to carry around with us. And it led me to, Herman Brock's The Sleepwalkers, and the more obscure and the more difficult, the better. And for years, I was only reading modernist literature and not very, very much of 19th century stuff at all.
Modernists like what?
Like Joyce, Proust. That's 1920s.
So you actually
so that's what I knew
backwards into.
And then I didn't read Tolstoy until I was about 25 years old.
Yes.
I had been assigned Dickens, and I of course had read 19th century, but I really hadn't engaged with it. But when I read Anna Karenina when I was 25, that's when I was amazed at the power of that kind of story. And
why do you think that?
Well, for very simple reasons. The characters they seemed real to me, and I became extremely involved with their stories, and I couldn't put the book down. All of those, old-fashioned qualities were still operating in the book 150 years later. And I don't think I'd ever had a reading experience so absorbing as Anna Karenina. So I knew there was still some kind of power in that sort of writing. You were talking the other day how you don't feel as bad about naturalism as you used to. And I've had a similar movement in my life where realism, when I started out, seemed to be a terribly, kind of illicit activity to engage in. And I tried to write very experimental work. And now I love writers who actually can give me the world in the most honest and truest way. And I think it's very difficult to do. I think a lot of books say that they're realistic, but you read them and it's not realistic at all. But there's very few writers, when you read them, you actually feel like you're getting reality. And that still excites me, even in this late day.
What do you think about that? That's why is it difficult to write realistically about the world?
Well, there's a lot to capture. I think it's difficult to write in any way, whatever style you choose. But realism is hard in part because life isn't as interesting as a story. I mean, it's not like when you write a story, you're selecting and arranging things so that they are useful in the form of a novel. So how do you strike the balance of being accurate or authentic while at the same time being interesting and being entertaining? If I wanted to write from the perspective of a child, for example. You could take a dictaphone and interview a child, but the transcription of that wouldn't be interesting unless it was your own child. And but secondly, and really strangely, it might not even evoke reality. And part of writing realistically is also departing from reality. Like a thing doesn't actually best represent itself in art. Sometimes, if you look at the Cubists, that was their struggle to depict reality in a way that, taken out of context or without an attempt to understand it, looks really strange and looks nothing at all like life as we normally see it and experience it. But in fact probably does a better job of a nude descending a staircase than a video of the very same thing does. So maybe that's what's hard about it, is staying close to it but also moving away from it so that you can create an experience that's interesting, that's dramatic, that's entertaining, but also that feels real. Whether or not it actually is real, that it feels real.
I mean, sometimes I would say that, the voice in Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, which is a child's voice, and you've said it's not really a child's voice. It's a kind of not realistic rendering of something that actually gives you the feeling of a child. And I think that I've tried to write in that way as well. One of the things fiction can do is allows you to write impossible voices that don't exist in the world. And with Virgin Suicides, when I have this first-person plural voice, you don't know who's actually the narrator and where the voice is coming from. But it allowed me to really tell a story that I think is realistic about a town with a voice that is completely impossible and unrealistic. So sometimes you have to adopt an impossible means in order to actually get to the heart of your subject.
And to get to the heart of the reader. I mean, that was what was so successful about that voice, I think, is it was, despite being totally impossible, it was entirely believable. Like, when I read it, I actually didn't wonder where it was coming from or how it could be. I was just immersed in it.
Because my first book, I had no idea that anyone was going to read it, so I wasn't thinking.
I only think because you were my
about the
teacher,
reader.
I had to.
Yeah.
But also, it was a really, really good way of making the reader complicit. Like, the kind of like anonymity of it, and also that it was a plural narrator. It just made it impossible to stand apart from it, to not be somehow involved in the telling of the story.
I interviewed a few years ago Philip Roth about how he feels about writing, and he said, quote, "When I write, I'm alone. It's filled with fear and loneliness and anxiety." So I asked Roth, how can you do it? How can you continue? And he sighed then loudly, and then he said that there are a few days that compensate totally. In my life, I've had in total a couple of months of these completely wonderful days as a writer, and that's enough. And then afterwards he added, I have no idea that I can do it again. How can I know? How do I know that I won't run out of ideas tomorrow? It's a horrible existence being a writer, filled with deprivation. I don't miss specific people, but I do miss life. And this is a guy who is actually producing a new book every second year.
That's the most heartwarming thing I've ever heard, actually. That's wonderful.
Do you feel the same?
I feel exactly like that. That's exactly how I feel. And Salinger felt the same way. There were only a few days, a year that were worth it.
So, Jeff, you agree that your existence is horrible and filled with deprivation?
Most days when I'm working, I have a high anxiety level, and I have a fair amount of fear while I'm writing a book. And sometimes the battle is to not let your doubt actually turn, keep you from writing at all. It's something you need. You need to hate your work in order to try to make it better, but if you hate it too much, you will stop writing. So
You need to hate it in a way that it's not yet good enough.
You need to hate it, and you need to doubt yourself, and you can never think you're doing well, I think. But if you indulge in that too much, you actually might stop writing, as Jonathan is warning about. So you have to keep it in balance, but you do need the fear and the loneliness and the anxiety, I think. At least I do. I think you like to write in a happier mood, you said the other day, but...
I would prefer it, but I mean, there are other consolations in life. It's not like, maybe Philip Roth is a little bit different because he really has removed himself. I don't know him, but this is just my impression. No matter how bad writing is, I still have kids and I have a wife and I have, I like my neighborhood, I have a dog, I get to watch movies, I'm alive. It's not like, I'm not trapped in my writing. When I am writing, I am trapped in my writing and I find it very difficult. And I can't think of anything that inspires more. I mean, the nicest way to put it is probably insecurity, but it's actually much worse than that.
Yeah, but in what way is it worse?
In what way is it worse?
Yeah.
Well, because there's nobody to blame but yourself. You're completely unconstrained. I mean, in everything else that you do in life, there is always another explanation than that you don't have an active enough imagination or you don't care about anything enough to express it thoughtfully or deeply enough, or you don't have the ability to express things that you think about and feel. And, if you think about it, most things that you do in the course of a day don't work out exactly as they ought to in the ideal world, but there are reasons why, and we accept the reasons, and we just incorporate all of that into the general imperfections of life. But when you're writing, it's just you, and it's absolutely... The freedom is what's most exhilarating about writing, and I think what draws a lot of writers to writing, but it's also the thing that makes it so difficult.
Both of you are from immigrant families, Jewish family and a Greek family. And Jonathan, you wrote, I think, in Eating Animals about your grandmother and about how being in this family was to be brought up with stories. And to be brought up in an immigrant family like this, there's a lot of stories about the family, about the past, about other countries, about other cultures, and so on. Did that affect the way you think about stories and the way you create your own stories?
I'm sure it did. I don't know if I know exactly how. Immigrants typically take their stories in place of belongings. They don't have physical artifacts of where they come from, or the only way to transmit history and to transmit values is through story. So, Jews have been especially good at that because there's been a special need for it historically. I also think it's probably true that outsiders, whether they're immigrants or not, have a stronger necessity to tell stories. It's not a coincidence that in the 20th century, so much of the great art came from outsider communities, whether it was Jewish literature or black music or the visual arts, which was really dominated by a couple of different outsider groups. The inability to, or any difficulty in assimilating into a mainstream community or society makes you feel a stronger need to find ways of expressing yourself. I mean, it's one reason to wonder about what American art and literature will look like as America moves from a place that not only welcomed but really celebrated immigrants to a place that seems to be less interested in that.
Mm.
Well, I guess every American is an immigrant, but I have to say that I'm not really from an immigrant family. My mother's side goes back quite a long time, and they're basically hillbillies from Kentucky. So I grew up, half of my family, singing bluegrass music, and my grandmother would sing me "Shoe Fly Ply" and all of these old songs. And both my parents were born in the States, so my parental grandparents were from Asia Minor, and I did get a little bit of a sense of immigrant life through them, but they died when I was fairly young. So I've had to imagine and almost invent my own immigrant story in order to write about it. And I only wrote about it because it pertained to the story I wanted to write, about this intersex person whose origins begin in Asia Minor.
Right.
So I had to Greek it up to the maximum. And I didn't really know much about my Greek side. I wasn't brought up, I was baptized Greek Orthodox, but I wasn't brought up in the religion.
But it was Greek. I mean, you didn't choose Polish.
No, I chose Greek because I did, I thought maybe I know something about it, a little, and my name is Greek, so that's fine. But I could have chosen Polish. I mean, it was that far removed
Right.
that I had to do research into my own heritage in order to make it seem as though my character knew about these things. I knew nothing about the history, nothing about the culture. I spent a lot of time reading about the folklore that Greek immigrants to America, had, and in that way, people now will say you're an immigrant writer. But the truth is, I'm very much a hybrid personality, and I don't know who I am. And my books seem to be about a search for identity. And I think you were talking about this the other day, that you're not aware, a writer isn't aware of what his themes are until he's written a couple of books, and then you see patterns developing, and usually journalists tell you what those are, and sometimes they seem, outlandish, and sometimes they seem correct. But I do see that I constantly am writing about characters who don't really know who they are. They don't have a fixed identity, and sometimes it's a genetic disparity or miscegenation, and sometimes it's more cultural. But that's because I really don't know what I'm supposed to call myself. I'm just a mongrelized American, like most Americans. But it's sometimes difficult to write from that perspective because it's not immediately recognizable to people.
Right. But in a way, that was also what you were just talking about, this search for identity in immigrant families, wasn't it? In arts, different arts, music, literature. It's really the same, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, it's certainly not exclusive to immigrants. Everybody, I mean, it's a little bit like the conversation about family in books. Like, books are always about people who are searching. Otherwise, there's no story to tell. What's the old saying? Once upon a time, there was a man whose life was so good, there's no story to tell about it. You only tell a story because someone has a problem, because somebody has to get to a different place from where he or she began. So, finding out who you are, what you care about, what you're actually thinking and feeling is a kind of problem that has inspired a lot of books.